Hey, Michael, what are you looking at?
I'm looking for heaven, Daddy. I want to find God. It's so big out there. Where is heaven anyway? Which direction should I look in?
Michael, it's a vast universe out there. Let's see if I can break it down for you and make it easier for you to understand.
Okay, Daddy, I'd like that.
Heaven is located in the central universe of Havana. At the heart of this eternal and central universe is the stationary Isle of Paradise, the geographic center of infinity, and the dwelling place of the eternal God. And Paradise, Michael, is motionless, being the only stationary thing in the universe of universes. The Isle of Paradise has a universe location, but no position in space. And to help you better understand it, this eternal isle is the actual source of the physical universes, past, present, and future. So heaven is the perfect and divine universe which occupies the center of all creation. It is the eternal core around which the vast creations of time and space revolve.
So what does that mean to us here on Earth, Daddy?
Michael, our planet Earth is part of Nebadon, which is one of 7 evolutionary super-universes. Earth is one of many inhabited planets in our local universe of Nebadon that is evolving all the time. There are many planets in our local universe.
Wow, Daddy, that's awesome.
And there are 7 universes in the Grand Universe, and Nebadon, who we on planet Earth are evolving on, is part of Overtime.
So does that mean that Adam and Eve were the first cavemen, Dad?
No, Michael, Adam and Eve were not the first cavemen. The earliest recorded evidence that was ever found was in June of 1968 by William J. Meister, an amateur fossil collector in Antelope Springs, 43 miles west of Utah. Mr. Meister found footprints of a man wearing sandals, and embedded in the sandal was a crushed trilobite vertebrae that has been said by scientists to have become extinct at around 300 million years ago. So, Michael, the answer to your question is that somewhere between 300 and 600 million years ago, we have evidence that a civilized man had once visited this planet before our planet was able to support life as we know it. The human race is about 1 million years old. Primitive man made his evolutionary appearance on Earth a little less than 1 million years ago. The first human family on Earth was registered as an inhabited world when the first 2 human beings, the twins, were 11 years old and before they had become the parents of the firstborn of the second generation of actual human beings. In the Archangel message from Salvington on this occasion of formal planetary recognition closed with these words, "Man mind has appeared on 606 of Satania, and these parents of the new race shall be called Andon and Fanta." And all archangels pray that these creatures may speedily be endowed with the personal indwelling of the gift of the Spirit of the Universal Father. Andon is a Nebadon name which signifies the first father-like creature to exhibit human perfection hunger. Fanta signifies the first son-like creature to exhibit human perfection hunger. Andon and Fanta never knew these names until they were bestowed upon them at the time of infusion with their thought adjusters. Throughout their mortal sojourn on earth, they called each other Santa An and Santa N. Santa An meaning loved by mother, Santa N signifying loved by father. They gave themselves these names, and the meanings are significant of their mutual regard and affection. In many respects, Michael, Andon and Fanta were the most remarkable pair of human beings that ever lived on the face of the earth. This wonderful pair, the actual parents of all mankind, were in every way superior to many of their immediate descendants, and they were radically different from all of their ancestors, both immediate and remote. The parents of this first human couple were apparently little different from the average of their tribe, though they were among its more intelligent members, that group which first learned to throw stones and to use clubs in fighting. They also made use of sharp spicules of stone, flint, and bone. This family of Andon and Fanta held together until the 20th generation, when combined food competition and social friction brought about the beginning of dispersion. Primitive man, the Andonites, had black eyes and a swarthy complexion, something of a cross between yellow and red, Melanin is a coloring substance which is found in the skins of all human beings. It is the original andonic skin pigment. In general appearance and skin color, these early andonites more nearly resembled the present-day Eskimo than any other type of living human beings. They were the first creatures to use the skins of animals as a protection against cold. They had little more hair on their bodies than present-day humans. They were a wonderful tribe. The original Andonic clan maintained an unbroken line of leadership until the 27th generation, when no male offspring appeared among Santan's direct descendants. Two rivals would be rulers of the clan, fell to fighting for supremacy. Before the extensive dispersion of the Andonic clans, a well-developed language had evolved from their early efforts to intercommunicate. This language continued to grow, and almost daily additions were made to it because of the new inventions and adaptations to environment which were developed by these active, restless, and curious people. And this language became the word of earth, the tongue of the early human family, until the later appearance of the colored races. And as time passed, the Andonic clans grew in number, and the contact of the expanding families developed friction and misunderstandings. Only two things came to occupy the minds of these people: hunting to obtain food and fighting to avenge themselves against some real or supposed injustice or insult at the hands of the neighboring tribes. This early race and its primitive civilization were threatened with extinction by the incessant warfare of the clans. It is impossible to induce such primitive beings long to live together in peace, manage the descendant of fighting animals, and when closely associated, uncultured people irritate and offend each other. The life carriers know this tendency among evolutionary creatures and accordingly make provision for the eventual separation of developing human beings into at least 3 and more often 6 distinct and separate races. The early Andon races did not penetrate very far into Asia, and they did not at first enter Africa. The geography of those times pointed them north, and farther north these people journeyed until they were hindered by the slowly advancing ice of the third glacier. Before this extensive ice sheet reached France and the British Isles, the descendants of Andon and Fonta had pushed on westward over Europe and had established more than 1,000 separate settlements along the great rivers leading to the then warm waters of the North Sea. These Andonic tribes were the early river dwellers of France. They lived along the river Somme for thousands of years. The Somme is the one river unchanged by the glaciers, running down to the sea in those days much as it does today, and that explains why so much evidence of the Andonic descendants is found along the course of this river valley. These aborigines of Earth were not tree dwellers. Though in emergencies they still betook themselves to the treetops, they regularly dwelt under the shelter of overhanging cliffs along the rivers and in hilltop grottos, which afforded a good view of the approaches and sheltered them from the elements. They could thus enjoy the comfort of their fires without being too much inconvenienced by the smoke. They were not really cave dwellers either, though in subsequent times the latter ice sheets came farther south and drove their descendants to the caves. They preferred to camp near the edge of a forest and beside a stream. They very early became remarkably clever in disguising their partially sheltered abodes and showed great skill in constructing stone sleeping chambers, dome-shaped stone huts into which they crawled at night. The entrance to such a hut was closed by a rolling stone in front of it, a large stone which had been placed inside for this purpose before the roof stones were finally put in place. The Andonites were fearless and successful hunters and, with the exception of wild berries and certain fruits of the tree, lived exclusively on flesh. As Andon had invented the stone axe, so his descendants early discovered and made effective use of the throwing stick and the harpoon. At last, the tool-creating mind was functioning in conjunction with an implementing using hand, and these early humans became highly skilled in the fashioning of flint tools. They traveled far and wide in search of flint, much as present-day humans journey to the ends of the earth in quest of gold, platinum, and diamonds. And in many ways, these Andon tribes manifested a degree of intelligence which their retrogressing descendants did not attain in 500,000 years, though they did again and again rediscover various methods of kindling fire. As the Andonic dispersion extended, the cultural and spiritual status of the class retrogressed for nearly 10,000 years until the days of Onager, who assumed the leadership of these tribes, brought peace among them, and for the first time led all of them in the worship of the breath-giver to men and animals. Andon's philosophy had been most confused. He had barely escaped becoming a fire worshipper because of the great comfort derived from his accidental discovery of fire. Reason, however, directed him from his own discovery to the sun as a superior and more awe-inspiring source of heat and light, but it was too remote, and so he failed to become a sun worshipper. The Andonites early developed a fear of the elements: thunder, lightning, rain, snow, hail, and ice. But hunger was the constantly recurring urge of these early days, and since they largely subsisted on animals, they eventually evolved a form of animal worship. To Andon, the larger food animals were symbols of creative might and sustaining power. From time to time, it became the custom to designate various of these animals as objects of worship. During the vogue of a particular animal, crude outlines of it would be drawn on the walls of the caves, and later on, as continued progress was made in the arts, such an animal god was engraved on various ornaments. Very early, the Andonic peoples formed the habit of refraining from eating the flesh of the animal of tribal veneration. Presently, in order more suitably to impress the minds of their youths, they evolved the ceremony of reverence which was carried out about the body of one of those venerated animals, and still later on, this primitive performance developed into the more elaborate sacrificial ceremonies of their descendants. And this is the origin of sacrifices as part of worship. This idea was elaborated by Moses in the Hebrew ritual and was preserved in principles by the Apostle Paul as the doctrine of atonement for sin by the shedding of blood. That food was an all-important thing in the lives of these primitive human beings is shown by the prayer taught these simple folks by Onager, their great teacher, and his prayer was, "O breath of life, give us this day our daily food, deliver us from the curse of the ice, save us from our forest enemies, and with mercy receive us into the great beyond." Onager maintained headquarters on the northern shores of the ancient Mediterranean in the region of the present Caspian Sea at a settlement called Oban, the tarrying place on the westward turning of the travel trail leading up northwards from the Mesopotamian Southland. From Oban, he sent out teachers to the remote settlements to spread his new doctrines of one deity and his concept of the hereafter, which he called the Great Beyond. These emissaries of Onager were the world's first missionaries. They were also the first human beings to cook meat, the first regularly to use fire in the preparation of food. They cooked flesh on the ends of sticks and also on hot stones. Later on, they roasted large pieces in the fire, but their descendants almost entirely reverted to the use of raw flesh. Onager was born 983,400 years ago, and he lived to be 69 years of age. The record of the achievements of this mastermind and spiritual leader of the pre-planetary prince days is a thrilling recital of the organization of these primitive peoples into a real society. He instituted an efficient tribal government, the likes of which was not attained by succeeding generations in many millenniums. Never again until the arrival of the planetary prince was there such a spiritual civilization on earth. These simple people had a real though primitive religion, but it was subsequently lost to their deteriorating descendants. 950,000 years ago, the descendants of Andon and Fonta had migrated far to the east and to the west. And it was during this time that England was connected by land with France, while Africa was joined to Europe by the Sicilian land bridge. In later times, they penetrated eastward as far as Java, where their bones were so recently found, the so-called Java man, and then journeyed on to Tasmania. Fewer and fewer of the primitive settlements maintained the worship of the breath-giver. This early dawn civilization was threatened with extinction. 900,000 years ago, the arts of Andon and Fonta and the culture of Onager were vanishing from the face of the earth. Culture, religion, and even flintworks were at their lowest ebb. These were the times when larger numbers of inferior mongrel groups were arriving in England from southern France. These tribes were so largely mixed with the forest ape-like creatures that they were scarcely human. They had no religion but were crude flint workers and possessed sufficient intelligence to kindle fire. They were followed in Europe by a somewhat superior and prolific people whose descendants soon spread over the entire continent from the ice in the north to the Alps and the Mediterranean in the south. These tribes are the so-called Heidelberg race. During this long period of cultural decadence, the Foxhall people of England and the Baddanan tribes northwest of India continued to hold on to some of the traditions of Andon and certain remnants of the culture of Onager. The Foxhall peoples were farthest west and succeeding in retaining much of the Andonic culture. They also preserved their knowledge of flintworking, which they transmitted to their descendants, the ancient ancestors of the Eskimos. Though the remains of the Foxhall peoples were the last to be discovered in England, these Andonites were really the first human beings to live in those regions. At that time, the land bridge still connected France with England, and since most of the early settlements of the Andon descendants were located along the rivers and seashores of that early day, they are now under the waters of the English Channel and the North Sea, but some 3 or 4 are still above water on the English coast. Many of the more intelligent and spiritual of the Foxhall peoples maintained their racial superiority and perpetuated their primitive religious customs, and these people, as they were later admixed with subsequent stocks, journeyed on west from England after a latter ice visitation and have survived as the present-day Eskimos. Besides the Foxhall peoples in the west, another struggling center of culture persisted in the east. This group is located in the foothills of the northwestern Indian highlands among the tribes of Baddanan, a great-great-grandson of Andon. These people were the only descendants of Andon who never practiced human sacrifice. These highland Baddanites occupied an extensive plateau surrounded by forest, traversed by streams, and abounding in game. Like some of their cousins in Tibet, they lived in crude stone huts, hillside grottos, and semi-underground passages. While the tribes of the north grew more and more to fear the ice, those living near the homeland of their origin became exceedingly fearful of the water. They observed the Mesopotamian peninsula gradually sinking into the ocean, and though it emerged several times, the traditions of these primitive races grew up around the dangers of the sea and the fear of periodic engulfment. And this fear, together with their experience with river floods, explains why they sought out the highlands as a safe place in which to live. To the east of the Baddanan peoples, in the Silawalik Hills of northern India, may be found fossils that approach nearer to transition types between man and the various pre-human groups than any others on Earth. 850,000 years ago, the superior Baddanan tribes began a warfare of extermination directed against their inferior and animalistic neighbors. In less than 1,000 years, most of the borderland animal groups of these regions have been either destroyed or driven back to the southern forest. This campaign for the extermination of inferiors brought about a slight improvement in the hill tribes of that age, and the mixed descendants of this improved Baddanite stock appeared on the stage of action as an apparently new people, the Neanderthal race. The Neanderthalers were excellent fighters and they traveled extensively. They gradually spread from the highland centers in northwest India to France on the west, China on the east, and even down into northern Africa. They dominated the world for almost 500,000 years until the times of the migration of the evolutionary races of color. 800,000 years ago, game was abundant. Many species of deer, as well as elephants and hippopotamuses, roamed over Europe. Cattle were plentiful. Horses and wolves were everywhere. The Neanderthalers were great hunters, and the tribes in France were the first to adopt the practice of giving the most successful hunters the choice of women for wives. The reindeer was highly useful to these Neanderthal peoples, serving as food, clothing, and for tools, since they made various uses of the horns and bones. They had little culture, but they greatly improved the work in flint until it almost reached the levels of the days of Andon. Large flints attached to wooden handles came back into use and served as axes and picks. 750,000 years ago, the fourth ice sheet was well on its way south. With their improved implements, the Neanderthalers made holes in the ice covering the northern rivers and thus were able to spear the fish which came up through these vents. Ever these tribes retreated before the advancing ice, which at this time made its most extensive invasion of Europe. In these times, the Siberian glacier was making its southernmost march, compelling early man to move southward, back towards the land of his origin. But the human species had so differentiated that the danger of further mingling with its non-progressive simian relatives was greatly lessened. 700,000 years ago, the fourth glacier, the greatest of all in Europe, was in recession. Men and animals were returning north. The climate was cool and moist, and primitive man again thrived in Europe and Western Asia. Gradually the forest spread north over land, which had been so recently covered by the glacier. Mammal life had been little changed by the great glacier. These animals persisted in that narrow belt of land laying below the ice and the Alps, and upon the retreat of the glacier, again rapidly spread out over all Europe. There arrived from Africa, over the Sicilian land bridge, straight-tusked elephants, broad-nosed rhinoceroses, hyenas, and African lions, and these new animals virtually exterminated the saber-toothed tigers and the hippopotamuses. 650,000 years ago witnessed a continuation of the mild climate. By the middle of the interglacial period, it had become so warm that Alps were almost denuded of ice and snow. 600,000 years ago, the ice had reached its then northernmost point of retreat, and after a pause of a few thousand years, started south again on its fifth excursion. But there was little modification of climate for 50,000 years. Man and the animals of Europe were little changed. The slight aridity of the former period lessened, and the alpine glaciers descended far down the river valleys. 550,000 years ago, the advancing glacier again pushed man and the animals south, but this time had plenty of room in the wide belt of land stretching northeast into Asia and lying between the ice sheet and the then greatly expanded Black Sea extension of the Mediterranean. These times of the fourth and fifth glaciers witnessed the further spread of the crude culture of the Neanderthal races, but there was little progress that it truly appeared as though the attempt to produce a new and modified type of intelligent life on Earth was about to fail. For almost 250,000 years, these primitive peoples drifted on, hunting and fighting, by spells improving in certain directions, but on the whole, steadily retrogressing as compared with their superior Andonic ancestors. During these spiritually dark ages, the culture of superstitious mankind reached its lowest levels. The Neanderthalers really had no religion beyond a shameful superstition. They were deathly afraid of clouds, more especially of mists and fogs. A primitive religion of the fear of natural forces gradually developed, while animal worship declined as improvement in tools with abundance of game enabled these people to live with less anxiety about food. The sex rewards of the chase tended greatly to improve hunting skill. This new religion of fear led to attempts to placate the invisible forces behind these natural elements and culminated later on in the sacrificing of humans to appease these invisible and unknown physical forces. And this terrible practice of human sacrifice has been perpetuated by the more backward peoples of Earth right on down to the 20th century. These early Neanderthalers could hardly be called sun worshippers. They rather lived in fear of the dark. They had a mortal dread of nightfall. As long as the moon shone a little, they managed to get along, but in the dark of the moon they grew panicky and began the sacrifice of their best specimens of manhood and womanhood in an effort to induce the moon again to shine. The sun, they early learned, would regularly return, but the moon, they conjectured, only returned because they sacrificed their fellow tribesmen. As the race advanced, the object and purpose of sacrifice progressively changed, but the offering of human sacrifice as a part of religious ceremonial long persisted. 500,000 years ago, the Badnan tribes of the northwestern highlands of India became involved in another great racial struggle. For more than 100 years, this relentless warfare raged, and when the long fight was finished, only about 100 families were left. But these survivors were the most intelligent and desirable of all the then living descendants of Andon and Fanta.
So, Dad, I've got different friends in school. One's black, another's Chinese, and my skin is white. How'd that happen? Did we all come from different universes?
In answer to your question, Michael, yes, we do. And now, among those highland Badenites, there was a new and strange occurrence. A man and woman living in the northeastern part of the then inhabited highland region began suddenly to produce a family of unusually intelligent children. This was the Sangig family, the ancestors of all of the 6 colored races of Earth. These Sangig children, 19 in number, were not only intelligent above their fellows, but their skins manifested a unique tendency to turn various colors upon exposure to sunlight. Among these 19 children were 5 red, 2 orange, 4 yellow, 2 green, 4 blue, and 2 indigo. These colors became more pronounced as the children grew older, and when these youths later mated with their fellow tribesmen, all of their offspring tended toward the skin color of the Sangig parent. And now I interrupt the chronological narrative after calling attention to the arrival of the planetary prince at about this time, while we separately consider the 6 Sangig races of Earth. On an average evolutionary planet, the 6 evolutionary races of color appear one by one. The red man is the first to evolve, and for ages he roams the world before the succeeding color races make their appearance. The simultaneous emergence of all 6 races on Earth and in one family was most unusual. The appearance of the earlier Adenites on Earth was also something new instantaneous. On no other world in the local system has such a race of will creatures evolved in advance of the evolutionary races of color. The red man. These peoples were remarkable specimens of the human race, in many ways superior to Andon and Fanta. They were the most intelligent group and were the first of the Sangig children to develop a tribal civilization and government. They were always monogamous. Even their mixed descendants seldom practiced plural mating. In later times, they had serious and prolonged trouble with their yellow brethren in Asia. They were aided by their early invention of the bow and arrow, but they had unfortunately inherited much of the tendency of their ancestors to fight amongst themselves, and this so weakened them that the yellow tribes were able to drive them off the Asiatic continent. About 85,000 years ago, the comparatively pure remnants of the red race went in mass across to North America, and shortly thereafter the Bering Land isthmus sank, thus isolating them. No red man ever returned to Asia, but throughout Siberia, China, Central Asia, India, and Europe, they left behind much of their stock blended with the other colored races. When the red man crossed over into America, he brought along much of the teachings and traditions of his early origin. His immediate ancestors had been in touch with the latter activities of the world headquarters of the planetary prince, but in a short time after reaching the Americas, the red man began to lose sight of these teachings, and there occurred a great decline in intellectual and spiritual culture. Very soon these people again fell to fighting so fiercely amongst themselves that it appeared that these tribal wars would result in the speedy extinction of this remnant of the comparatively pure red race. Because of this great retrogression, the red man seemed doomed when, about 65,000 years ago, Onamonalontum appeared as their leader and spiritual deliverer. He brought temporary peace among the Indian red men and revived their worship of the Great Spirit. Onamonalontum lived to be 96 years of age and maintained his headquarters among the great redwood trees of California. Many of his latter descendants have come down to modern times among the Blackfoot Indians. As time passed, the teachings of Onamonalontum became hazy traditions. Internecine wars were resumed, and never after the days of this great teacher did another leader succeed in bringing universal peace among them. Increasingly, the more intelligent strains perished in these tribal struggles. Otherwise, a great civilization would have been built upon the North American continent by these able and intelligent red men. After crossing over to America from China, the northern red man never again came in contact with another world influences except the Eskimo until he was later discovered by the white man. It was most unfortunate that the red man almost completely missed his opportunity of being upstepped by the admixture of the later Adamic stock. As it was, the red man could not rule the white man, and he would not willingly serve him. In such a circumstance, if the two races do not blend, one or the other is doomed. The Orange Man, the outstanding characteristic of this race was their peculiar urge to build anything and everything, even to piling up of vast mounds of stone just to see which tribe could build the largest mound. Though they were not a progressive people, they profited much from the schools of the prince and sent delegates there for instruction. The Orange race was the first to follow the coastline southward towards Africa as the Mediterranean Sea withdrew to the west, but they never secured a favorable footing in Africa and were wiped out of existence by the latter arriving green race. Before the end came, this people lost much cultural and spiritual ground, but there was a great revival of higher learning as a result of the wise leadership of Porshunta, the mastermind of this unfortunate race, who ministered to them when their headquarters was at Armageddon some 300,000 years ago. The last great struggle between the Orange and the Green men occurred in the region of the Lower Nile Valley in Egypt. This long drawn-out battle was waged for almost 100 years, and at its close, very few of the Orange race were left alive. The shattered remnants of these people were absorbed by the Green and by the latter arriving Indigo men, but as a race, the Orange men ceased to exist about 100,000 years ago. The Yellow Man. The primitive yellow tribes were the first to abandon the chase, establish settled communities, and develop a home life based on agriculture. Intellectually, they were somewhat inferior to the red man, but socially and collectively they proved themselves superior to all of the Sangeet people in the matter of fostering racial civilizations. Because they developed a fraternal spirit, the various tribes, learning to live together in various peace, they were able to drive the red race before them as they gradually expanded into Asia. They traveled far from the influences of the spiritual headquarters of the world and drifted into great darkness following the Caligastia apostasy. But there occurred one brilliant age among these people when Singlanton, about 100,000 years ago, assumed the leadership of these tribes and proclaimed the worship of the one truth. The survival of comparatively large numbers of the yellow race is due to their intertribal peacefulness. From the days of Singlelanton to the times of modern China, the yellow race has been numbered among the more peaceful of the nations of earth. This race received a small but potent legacy of the latter imported Adamic stock. The Green Man. The Green race was one of the less able groups of primitive men, and they were greatly weakened by extensive migrations in different directions. Before their dispersion, these tribes experienced a great revival of culture under the leadership of Fantad some 350,000 years ago. The Green race split into three major divisions. The northern tribes were subdued, enslaved, and absorbed by the yellow and blue races. The eastern group was amalgamated with the Indian types of those days, and remnants still persist among them. The southern nation entered Africa, where they destroyed their almost equally inferior Orange cousins. In many ways, both groups were evenly matched in this struggle, since each carried strains of the giant order, many of their leaders being 8 and 9 feet in height. These giant strains of the Green men were mostly confined to the southern or Egyptian nation. The remnants of the victorious Green men were subsequently absorbed by the Indigo race, the last of the colored peoples to develop and emigrate from the original Sangeet center of race dispersion. The Blue Man. The Blue men were a great people. They early invented the spear and subsequently worked out the rudiments of many of the arts of modern civilization. The Blue Man had the brain power of the Red Man associating with the soul and sentiment of the yellow man. The Adamic descendants preferred them to all of the latter persisting colored races. The early blue men were responsive to the persuasions of the teachers of Prince Caligastia's staff and were thrown into great confusion by the subsequent perverted teachings of those treacherous leaders. Like other primitive races, they never fully recovered from the turmoil produced by Caligastia's betrayal, nor did they ever completely overcome their tendency to fight among themselves. About 500 years after Caligastia's downfall, a widespread revival of learning and religion of a primitive sort, but nonetheless real and beneficial, occurred. Orlandorff became a great teacher among the blue race and led many of the tribes back to the worship of the true God under the names of the Supreme Chief. This was the greatest advance of the blue man until those later times when this race was so greatly upstepped by the admixture of the Adamic stock. The European researches and explorations of the Old Stone Age have largely to do with unearthing the tools, bones, and art craft of these ancient blue men, for they persisted in Europe until recent times. The so-called white races of Earth are the descendants of these blue men, as they were first modified by slight mixtures with yellow and red, and as they were later greatly upstepped by assimilating the greater portion of the violet race. The indigo race. As the red men were the most advanced of all the Sangeet peoples, so the black men were the least progressive. They were the last to migrate from their highland homes. They journeyed to Africa, taking possession of the continent, and have ever since remained there except when they have been forcefully taken away from age to age as slaves. Isolated in Africa, the indigo peoples, like the red man, received little or none of the race elevation which would have been derived from the infusion of the Adamic stock. Alone in Africa, the indigo race made little advancement until the days of Orvenon, when they experienced a great spiritual awakening. While they later almost entirely forgot the God of gods proclaimed by Orvenon, they did not entirely lose the desire to worship the unknown. At least they maintained a form of worship up to a few thousand years ago. Notwithstanding their backwardness, these indigo peoples have exactly the same standing before the celestial powers as any other earthly race. These were ages of intense struggles between the various races, but near the headquarters of the planetary prince, the more enlightened and more recently taught groups lived together in comparatively harmony. Though no great cultural conquest of the world races had been achieved up to the time of the serious disruption of this regime by the outbreak of the Lucifer Rebellion. From time to time, all of these different peoples experienced cultural and spiritual revivals. Mansent was a great teacher of the post-planetary prince days, but mention is made only of these outstanding leaders and teachers who markedly influenced and inspired a whole race. With the passing of time, many lesser teachers arose in different regions, and in the aggregate, they contributed much to the sum total of those saving influences which prevented the total collapse of cultural civilizations, especially during the long and dark ages between the Caligastia Rebellion and the arrival of Adam. When the colored descendants of the Sangrit family began to multiply, and as they sought opportunity for expansion into adjacent territory, the fifth glacier, the third of geological count, was well advanced on its southern drift over Europe and Asia. These early colored races were extraordinarily tested by the rigors and hardships of the glacial age of their origin. This glacier was so extensive in Asia that for thousands of years migration to eastern Asia was cut off, and not until the latter retreat of the Mediterranean Sea subsequent upon the elevation of Arabia was it possible for them to reach Africa. Thus it was that for almost 100,000 years these Sangrit peoples spread out along the foothills and mingled together more or less, notwithstanding the peculiar but naturally antipathy which early manifested itself between the different races. Between the times of the planetary prince and Adam, India became the home of the most cosmopolitan population ever to be found on the face of the earth. but it was unfortunate that this mixture came to contain so much of the green, orange, and indigo races. These secondary Sangrit peoples found existence more easy and agreeable in the Southlands, and many of them subsequently migrated to Africa. The primary Sangrit peoples, the superior races, avoided the tropics, the red man going northeast to Asia, closely followed by the yellow man, while the blue race moved northwest into Europe. The red men easily began to migrate to the northeast on the heels of the retreating ice, passing around the highlands of India and occupying all of northeastern Asia. They were closely followed by the yellow tribes, who subsequently drove them out of Asia into North America. When the relatively pure line remnants of the red race forsook Asia, there were 11 tribes, and they numbered a little over 7,000 men, women, and children. These tribes were accompanied by 3 small groups of mixed ancestry, the largest of these being a combination of the orange and blue races. These 3 groups never fully fraternized with the red man and early journeyed southward to Mexico and Central America, where they were later joined by a small group of mixed yellows and reds. These people all intermarried and founded a new and amalgamated race, one which was much less warlike than the pure line red men. Within 5,000 years, this amalgamated race broke up into 3 groups, establishing the civilizations respectively of Mexico, Central America, and South America. The South American offshoot did receive a faint touch of the blood of Adam. To a certain extent, the early red and yellow men mingled in Asia, and the offspring of this union journeyed on to the east and along the southern east coast, and eventually were driven by the rapidly increasing yellow race onto the peninsulas and nearby islands of the sea. They are the present-day brown men. The yellow race had continued to occupy the central regions of Eastern Asia. Of all the 6 colored races that have survived in greatest numbers, while the yellow men now and then engaged in racial war, they did not carry on such incessant and relentless wars of extermination as were waged by the red, green, and orange men. These 3 races virtually destroyed themselves before they were finally all but annihilated by their enemies of other races. Since the 5th glacier did not extend so far south in Europe, the way was partially open for these Sangrit peoples to migrate to the northwest, and upon the retreat of the ice, the blue men, together with a few other small groups, migrated westward along the old trails of the Andan tribes. They invaded Europe in successive waves, occupying most of the continent. In Europe, they soon encountered the Neanderthal descendants of their early and common ancestor Andan. These older European Neanderthalers had been driven south and east by the glaciers, and thus were in position quickly to encounter and absorb their invading cousins of the Sangrit tribes. In general, and to start with, the Sangrit tribes were more intelligent than, and in most ways far superior to, the deteriorating descendants of the early Andonic plainsmen, and the mingling of these Sangrit tribes with the Neanderthalers led to the immediate improvement of the older race. It was this infusion of Sangrit blood, more especially that of the blue man, which produced that marked improvement in the Neanderthal peoples exhibited by the successive waves of increasing intelligent tribes that swept over Europe from the east. During the following interglacial period, this new Neanderthal race extended from England to India. The remnant of the blue race left in the old Persian peninsula later amalgamated with certain others, primarily the yellow, and the resultant blend, subsequently somewhat upstepped by the violet race of Adam, has persisted as the swarthy nomadic tribes of modern Arabs. The superior races sought the northern or temperate climates, while the orange, green, and indigo races successively gravitated to Africa over the newly elevated land bridge which separated the westward retreating Mediterranean from the Indian Ocean. The last of the Sangrit peoples to migrate from their center of race origin was the indigo man. About the time the green man was killing off the orange race in Egypt and greatly weakening himself in doing so, the great black exodus started south through Palestine along the coast, and later, when these physically strong indigo peoples overran Egypt, They wiped the green man out of existence by sheer force of numbers. These indigo races absorbed the remnants of the orange man and much of the stock of the green man, and certain of the indigo tribes were considered improved by this racial amalgamation. And so it appears that Egypt was first dominated by the orange man, then by the green, followed by the indigo or the black man, and still later by a mongrel race of indigo blue and modified green men. But long before Adam arrived, the blue men of Europe and the mixed races of Arabia had driven the indigo race out of Egypt and far south on the African continent. As the Sangrit migrations draw to a close, the green and orange races are gone. The red man holds North America, the yellow man Eastern Asia, the blue man Europe, and the indigo race has gravitated to Africa. India harbors a blend of the secondary Sangrit races, and the brown man, a blend of the red and the yellow, holds the islands of the Asiatic coast. An amalgamated race of rather superior potential occupies the highlands of South America. The pure Andonites live in the extreme northern regions of Europe and in Iceland, Greenland, and northeastern North America. During the periods of farthest glacial advance, the westernmost of the Andon tribes came very near being driven into the sea. They lived for years in a narrow southern strip of the present island of England, and it was the tradition of these repeated glacial advances that drove them to take to the sea when the sixth and last glacier finally appeared. They were the first marine adventurers. They built boats and started in search of new lands where they hoped might be free from the terrifying ice invasions, and some of them reached Iceland, others Greenland, but the vast majority perished from hunger and thirst on the open sea. A little more than 80,000 years ago, shortly after the red man entered northwestern North America, the freezing over of the North Seas and the advance of a local ice fields on Greenland drove these Eskimo descendants of the Earth Aborigines to seek a better land, a new home, and they were successful, safely crossing the narrow straits which then separated Greenland from the northeastern landmasses of North America. They reached the continent about 2,100 years after the red man arrived in Alaska. Subsequently, some of the mixed stock of the blue man journeyed westward and amalgamated with the latter-day Eskimos, and this union was slightly beneficial to the Eskimo tribes. About 5,000 years ago, a chance meeting occurred between an Indian tribe and a lone Eskimo group on the southeastern shores of Hudson Bay. These tribes found it difficult to communicate with each other, but very soon they intermarried, with the result that these Eskimos were eventually absorbed by the more numerous red men, and this represents the only contact of the North American red man with any other human stock to about 1,000 years ago, when the white man first chanced to land on the Atlantic coast. The struggles of these early ages were characterized by courage, bravery, and even heroism, and we all regret that so many of those sterling and rugged traits of your early ancestors have been lost to the latter-day races. While we appreciate the value of many of the refinements of advancing civilizations, we miss the magnificent persistency and superb devotion of our early ancestors, which oftentimes bordered on grandeur and sublimity. About 500,000 years ago, and concurrent with the appearance of the six-colored or Sangrit races, Caligastia, the planetary prince, arrived on Earth. There were almost 1/2 billion primitive human beings on Earth at the time of the prince's arrival, and they were well scattered over Europe, Asia, and Africa. The prince's headquarters were established in Mesopotamia and was about the center of the world's population. Caligastia was a Lanondeck son, number 9,344 of the secondary order. He was experienced in administration of the affairs of the local universe in general, and during later years with the management of the local systems of Satania in particular. Prior to the reign of Lucifer in Satania, Caligastia had been attached to the Council of the Life Carriers, advisors on Jerusalem. Lucifer elevated Caligastia to a position on his personal staff, and he acceptably filled 5 successive assignments of honor and trust. Caligastia was given the position of planetary prince of Earth and was sent out on his mission alone, but was accompanied by the usual corps of assistants and administrative helpers. At the head of this group was Delegastia, the associate assistant of the planetary prince. Delegastia was also a secondary Lanandek son, being numbered 300,019,407 of that order. He ranked as an assistant at the time of his assignment as Caligastia's associate. The planetary staff included a large number of angelic cooperators and a host of other celestial beings assigned to advance the interests and promote the welfare of the human races. But from your standpoint, the most interesting group of all were the corporal members of the prince's staff, sometimes referred to as the Caligasta's 100. The headquarters of the planetary prince was situated in the Persian Gulf region in those days, in the district corresponding to later Mesopotamia. The arrival of the prince's staff created a profound impression. While it required almost 1,000 years for the news to spread abroad, those tribes near the Mesopotamian headquarters were tremendously influenced by the teachings and conduct of the 100 new sojourners on Earth, and much of your subsequent mythology grew out of the garbled legends of these early days. In skin color and language, these materialized members of the Caligasta staff followed the Andonic race. They partook of food, as did the mortals of the realms, with this difference. The recreated bodies of this group were fully satisfied by a non-flesh diet. This was one of the considerations which determined their residence in a warm region abounding in fruits and nuts. The 100 were material but superhuman beings, having been reconstituted on Earth as unique men and women of a high and special order. Each person of this group was capable of becoming co-parental to some new order of physical being, but they had been carefully instructed to resort to parenthood only under certain conditions. It is customary for the corporal staff of a planetary prince to procreate their successors sometime prior to retiring from special planetary service, usually this at or shortly after the time of the arrival of the planetary Adam and Eve. These special beings therefore had little or no idea as to what type of material creature would be produced by their sexual union. And they never did know. Before the time for such a step in the prosecution of their world work, the entire regime was upset by a rebellion, and those who later functioned in the parental role had been isolated from the life currents of the system. The Caligastia 100 were personally immortal or undying. There circulated through their material forms the anecdotal complements of the life currents of the system, and had they not lost contact with the life circuits through rebellion, they would have lived on indefinitely until the arrival of a subsequent Son of God, or until they are sometime later released to resume the interrupted journey to Havana and paradise. These anecdotal complements of the Satania life currents were derived from the fruit of the tree of life, a shrub of Videntia which was sent to earth by the Most High of Noladiadek at the time of Caligastia's arrival. In the days of Dalmatia, this tree grew in the central courtyard of the Temple of the Unseen Father, and it was the fruit of the tree of life that enabled the material and otherwise mortal beings of the prince's staff to live on indefinitely as long as they had access to it. At the time of Caligastia's arrival on earth, the world was caught up in slavery. Caligastia, as soon as after his arrival, proclaimed the new gospel of individual initiative within the social groups of that day, but this beneficent rule was soon interrupted that the race is never fully wholly liberated from the slavery of custom, fashion, still unduly, that dominated earth. The Caligastia 100, graduates of the Satania Mansions world, well knew the arts and culture of Jerusalem, but such knowledge is nearly valueless on a barbaric planet populated by primitive humans. These wise beings knew better than to undertake the sudden transformation or the en masse uplifting of the primitive races of that day. They well understood the slow evolution of the human species, and they wisely refrained from any radical attempts at modifying man's mode of life on earth. The planetary prince Caligastia instructed one of his disciples, Hap, to present the early races with a moral law. The code was known as the Father's Way and consisted of the following 7 commands. You shall not fear nor serve any god but the Father of all. You shall not disobey the Father's Son, the world's ruler, nor show disrespect to his superhuman associates. You shall not speak a lie when called before the judges of the people. You shall not kill men, women, or children. You shall not steal your neighbor's goods or cattle. You shall not touch your friend's wife. You shall not show disrespect to your parents or to the elders of the tribe. This was the law of Dalmatia for almost 300,000 years, and many of the stones on which this law was inscribed now lie beyond the waters off the shores of Mesopotamia and Persia. It became the custom to hold one of these commands in mind for each day of the week, using it for salutations and mealtime thanksgiving. The time measurement of these days was the lunar month, this period being reckoned as 28 days. The 7-day week was introduced by the Dalmatia teachers and grew out of the fact that 7 was 1/4 of the 28-day month. The significance of the number 7 in the super universe undoubtedly afforded them opportunity to introduce a spiritual reminder into the common reckoning of time, but there is no original origin for the weekly period. For 300,000 years, Caligastia had been in charge of Earth when Satan, Lucifer's assistant, made one of his periodic inspection calls. In the course of this inspection, Satan informed Caligastia of Lucifer's then proposed Declaration of Liberty, and as we now know, the prince agreed to betray the planet upon the announcement of the rebellion. The local universe of Nebadon's personalities looked with peculiar disdain upon Prince Caligastia because of his premeditated betrayal of trust. In all the administrative work of a local universe, no high trust is deemed more sacred than that reposed in a planetary prince who assumes responsibility for the welfare and guidance of the evolving mortals on a newly inhabited world. In committing this deliberate sin, Caligastia so completely distorted his personality that his mind has never since been able to fully gain its equilibrium. The immediate results of rebellion caused great confusion, which reigned in Dalmatia for almost 50 years after the instigation of the rebellion. The Caligastia scheme for the immediate reconstruction of human society, in accordance with his ideas of individual freedom and group liberties, proved a swift and more or less complete failure. Society quickly sank back to its old biological level, and the forward struggle began all over, starting not very far in advance of where it was at the beginning of the Caligastia regime, this upheaval having left the world in confusion, worse confounded. It was at that time, 38,000 years ago, that it was decided by the material sons of Jerusalem that the 6 colored evolutionary races on earth be blended and exalted by amalgamation with the progeny of the Adamic uplifters. The violet pair, Adam and Eve, were chosen to come to earth to mate with the evolving 6 races of colored people. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to The Grand Universe.
And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man in the moon. When you're coming home, Dad, I don't know when, but we'll get together then. Yeah, we're gonna have a good time then.